I'm Tracy Sable. Tonight on EWTN News Nightly, widening probe. A Republican lawmaker outlines the next steps in the investigation into business dealings that could involve President Biden. High court ruling. An update on abortion in Mexico following a decision by the country's Supreme Court. Faith in action. How a Catholic group is fighting homelessness in one U.S. state. And a holy family. The story behind a family of 7 on the path to sainthood. These stories and more tonight.
From EWTN, the Global Catholic Network, this is EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you for being with us. Our top story tonight, EWTN News Nightly has learned that an impeachment query against President Joe Biden is likely just weeks away. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales spoke with the chairman of the House Oversight Committee, Congressman James Comer, and joins us now with exclusive details.
Good evening, Tracy. Congressman James Comer says the evidence is overwhelming that then Vice President Joe Biden received millions of dollars from foreign nationals in a pay-to-play scheme. The Kentucky congressman tells me that he is now preparing to make his impeachment inquiry case to a full Republican conference in the next 2 to 3 weeks.
What's going to happen now in September is we will do an impeachment inquiry. That will give me more authority to win in court because the next batch of bank records I predict will show that Joe Biden was receiving benefits from all this corrupt money that his family was getting.
Congressman Comer tells me just recently he and his team discovered that Joe Biden was using fake names to hide his identity.
We found out that he was using pseudonyms, that 5,400 emails, government official emails, were sent back and forth for Joe Biden using a pseudonym, a fake name, and that Hunter was copied on these. Now we have testimony, we have pictures, we have emails, we have WhatsApp messages, we have text messages where Joe Biden communicated with all of the people that he said he never met with. So this begs the question, did Joe Biden violate the Foreign Agents Registration Act? And I believe he did.
White House spokesman Ian Sams tweeted Congressman Comer is lying. Quote, Comer claims that Biden's pseudonym email was code. That's nonsense.
It's par for the course for the White House to attack me when all we have are tons and tons of evidence of what I think is the biggest political scandal in my lifetime.
Congressman Comer claims the cover-up involves not just the White House, but other federal agencies. Comer tells me an FBI informant told the committee Secret Service was tipped off about a December 8, 2020 attempt to seek an interview with Hunter Biden, and DHS told the Secret Service not to respond.
There's so many guilty parties in this cover-up, I don't know where to begin, and that's why I subpoenaed Mayorkas this week, because I believe that the most obvious crime is the crime of telling people not to cooperate with the House Oversight Committee.
DHS responded, quote, the claim that we obstructed or withheld a response is categorically false, and these subpoenas are entirely without basis. DHS adds it is, quote, working to respond to this inquiry appropriately, including identifying the relevant information and individuals. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy has promised to hold an impeachment inquiry vote. However, there are still a number of Republicans who are not on board. At the Capitol, Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
According to a new CNN poll, most Americans think that President Joe Biden was involved in his son's business dealings with Ukraine and China while he served as vice president under Barack Obama. 61% think that President Biden had at least some involvement in Hunter Biden's business dealings while serving as vice president. 42% say they think he acted illegally. The poll was conducted before special counsel David Weiss said he intended to seek an indictment against Hunter Biden relating to gun charges. While the Biden administration continues blasting Alabama Senator Tommy Tuberville's hold on military nominees, saying it's hurting military readiness and is a threat to national security. However, the Republican isn't budging in his fight for the unborn. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen.
Tracy, the Biden administration is trying to keep up the pressure on the senator to give in, but Senator Tuberville says his military holds, quote, are not affecting national security no matter what national pundits are saying, end quote. And he's released a video on social media defending his position.
Senator Tommy Tuberville not backing down.
It just goes to show you this is all propaganda that's been carried on by the Secretary of Defense and the President of the United States saying, y'all got to start putting pressure on this senator.
The White House recently writing in a new Washington Post op-ed, Secretaries of the Navy, Air Force, Space Force, and Army are calling on Senator Tommy Tuberville to end his dangerous blockade on military appointments. But Senator Tuberville has forcefully denounced the Pentagon's abortion policy that pays for travel-related expenses, saying it's wrong and he wants it gone. As for the holds,
I'm not holding up any nominations from being approved. They can bring them one at a time to the floor. They have chosen not to do that.
Meanwhile, overseas in Ukraine, Secretary of State Antony Blinken continuing his two-day visit there, stopping at a school in a village where hundreds of residents were imprisoned early in the war.
127 people in a room not even fit for one person for human habitation. Children as young as a month old, not allowed to come out.
The Secretary of State describing what he calls the horrific human consequences of the Russian aggression against Ukraine.
Just yesterday, we saw the bombing of a market. 17 people or more killed, many others injured. A market. For what? This is what Ukrainians are living with every day.
And during her trip to the U.S.-ASEAN summit in Indonesia, Vice President Kamala Harris took a stance against North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. And the White House says she raised concerns regarding the grave human rights abuses being committed by the People's Republic of China.
Also tonight, President Biden is scheduled to travel to Germany and then on his way to India, where he plans to meet with Prime Minister Narendra Modi tomorrow and then take part in the G20 summit this coming weekend. At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
A reaction continues to pour in after Mexico's Supreme Court throws out all federal penalties for abortion. Yesterday's landmark decision requires federal health institutions to offer an abortion to anyone who requests it. However, around 20 states still have restrictions on abortion, and those measures may be the subject of upcoming lawsuits. The former president of Sri Lanka is denying allegations that he used the 2019 Easter bombings to win an election. He was responding to a report on a British television program that said Sri Lanka's intelligence community ignored claims about the attacks to try and influence the election later that year. Nearly 270 people were killed in the bombings on Catholic churches and a hotel. On new developments tonight in the coup in a Central African country. The ruling military says the ousted president is free to leave Gabon. The former leader had been under house arrest for 1 week. There are also reports his health is declining and that the military is allowing him to leave to receive medical care. Meantime, the coup leaders are promising a better life for the country's citizens. And we have a lot more still to come here on EWTN News Nightly, including defending the vulnerable. New claims about the role Catholics played in protecting Jewish people during World War II. And a closer look at a story in Canada regarding suspected mass graves and the Catholic Church. This week, there are new developments regarding a 2021 story out of Canada. At the time, reports said there were mass graves of Indigenous children found at residential schools in the North American country. Some of those schools were run by the Catholic Church. According to a new report, the recent excavation of 14 alleged burial sites unearthed no human remains. We go now to Colm Flynn, EWTN News Vatican Correspondent. Colm, great to be with you. First off, can you tell us more about these new developments in the story that we just mentioned?
A very good evening, Tracy. Yes, indeed, I can. Well, 2 years ago, after stories dominated the headlines around the world about alleged mass graves of Indigenous children at former residential schools right across Canada, it is now believed that the stories of these mass graves could be false after excavations have turned up no human remains. And you'll remember Pope Francis, he traveled to Canada last year, and indeed I went on that trip with the Holy Father. We reported on it extensively here on EWTN. There in Canada, the Pope apologized for the Church's role in the residential school system and the reported abuse of many of its members. The Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau demanded that the Vatican apologize for its role in the scandal in relation to the mass graves. Well, 2 years after the original stories of the mass graves broke, a series of recent excavations at suspected sites has turned up no human remains. Now, this has led many academics and politicians to say it's further evidence that the stories are unproven. A group of indigenous people, also known as Pine Creek First Nation, they excavated 14 sites in the basement of Our Lady of the Seven Sorrows Catholic Church that's near the Pine Creek Residential School during a 4-week period this summer. And eventually, the chief of the group, Derek Piniak, he went on record, held a press conference and said that no remains were found.
So, Colm, what's been the reaction around the world to these new revelations?
Well, sadly, Tracy, there hasn't been much coverage of this update of the story, especially when you compare it to the coverage of the original story that there were mass graves. If anyone at home now Googles Mass Graves Canada, you'll find thousands of results of networks and outlets reporting on the suspected mass graves, some even putting estimated numbers on the amount of children supposedly buried. And this story, Tracy, was covered all over the world on TV, radio, in all newspapers, reported as fact, by the way, in many cases. For example, at the time, the BBC interviewed an Indigenous chief who said that the residential school policy was, quote, designed to kill, and we're seeing proof of that, end quote. There was never any proof, and statements like this went unchallenged. And in Canada, there was a 260% rise in Catholic hate crimes. Churches were burnt down, priests and nuns suffered abuse on the streets, and online there was a huge amount of abusive posts towards the church. But, Tracy, if you search for the recent update of the story, that excavations have been carried out and so far no human remains have been found, you'll see that only a few outlets seem to have picked up on the story. One of the voices responding to the news is Jacques Rolliard. He is a professor emerite in the Department of History at the University of Montreal, and he said, quote, I don't like to use the word hoax because it's very strong, but there are just too many falsehoods circulating about this issue with no real evidence. He went on to say too much was said and decided upon before there was ever any proof, end quote.
Yeah, definitely more questions than answers on this right now. Colm, take us back to 2021. I mean, how did the allegations come to light in the first place? And also, what was the reaction? I mean, you mentioned some of it, but what really was the reaction at the time?
Well, there was, in May 2021, that's when the first stories come out. It was another Indigenous group. They claimed that they had made a shocking discovery of mass graves of around 200 Indigenous children. They were using ground-penetrating radar at a residential school in British Columbia. They named these children, they even put a name on the children, their group called The Missing. Now, the radar found what are labelled anomalies in the soil, but there was never any proof of actual human remains. But the story, like I said, was picked up. It spread like wildfire across the world, reported, again, as I said, as fact in many places, especially on social media, where people were outraged. And there was this image portrayed of the residential schools and the people who worked there, namely Catholic priests and nuns. The outrage, in fact, was so high-pitched that a former Canadian Attorney General called James McRae, he had to resign from a government panel just because he was skeptical at the time of the claim about these mass graves in the first place. He said, quote, the evidence does not support the overall gruesome narrative put forward around the world for several years, a narrative for which verifiable evidence is scarce and even non-existent, end quote. He was forced to step down because of that. Now, it's important, Tracy, to point out that there still are a number of other alleged sites of mass graves that have not been excavated, and there's no set dates to work on these sites. And we do know from speaking to many Indigenous former residents of the school, some even who I spoke to when I was there, who told me of a system where children were separated from their families for extended periods of time. There was assimilation, meaning that they were not allowed to learn about their Indigenous culture or history. They weren't allowed to speak their Indigenous language, and so on and so forth. But then again, Tracy, when I was there and we saw it in our reports on EWTN at the time, there were other Indigenous people I spoke to who had warm, fond memories of their time in these residential schools and spoke about the nuns and the priests that they encounter. In fact, one Indigenous man I remember speaking to, he told me that he couldn't understand the claims that were being made by others, again, because of his warm memories of being in these schools. But at the moment, Tracy, that is the update on this story. We'll continue to monitor it as it develops. But for just now, it's Colm Flynn here in Rome.
Up next on EWTN News Nightly, helping those in need. Learn more about a Catholic initiative helping the homeless in Kentucky. Plus, why an entire family is on the path to sainthood. Says each $100 rise in median rent brings with it a 9% increase in homelessness. According to the Government Accountability Office, the average rent has increased over the past 3 years by almost $250. So it may come as no surprise that the U.S. is experiencing a nationwide homelessness crisis. And now one Catholic group is taking an innovative approach to help the homeless. And joining us now is Ginny Ramsey, co-founder and president of the Catholic Action Center in Lexington, Kentucky. Ginny, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. As mentioned, homelessness is pretty much a crisis coast to coast right now. What are you seeing in Lexington and the surrounding areas?
Well, in our 24 years of the Catholic Action Center ministry, we've never seen such numbers. In fact, last Wednesday, we had volunteers and our Street Voice Council, which are folks who are experiencing homelessness, do a very comprehensive survey. And we have come up with numbers that are shocking our community. The number of families, the number of children, the number of elderly and disabled, this is our concern at the Catholic Action Center, trying to take care of the basic needs of the most vulnerable. All of our shelters are filled. We have to do something as a community to care for these most vulnerable men, women, and children.
Definitely. And Ginny, have you noticed an increase in unhoused people since the pandemic began?
Definitely. Our survey showed almost 600 folks that we could get to in that one day. Actually, there's a total of 2,500 that we counted, including programs and shelters and hospitals and jails. But the biggest change that we have seen has to do with the number of people who have been displaced since the pandemic. And sadly, part of it is a lot of folks' mental health. They just give up. Some of these men and women have never experienced homelessness before. Our biggest concern are those who are aging. We baby boomers are increasing numbers of those who are experiencing homelessness in Lexington because they're basically on a fixed income and the rents have increased so much. So we've got a tsunami of reasons, but it is impacting the most vulnerable.
Yeah, and Ginny, tell me about, what your group is doing, the proactive steps it's taking to not only meet the demand of those that are experiencing homelessness, but also to try and get ahead of the problem.
Well, one thing we do is we call in the community. We're a community-based group. We don't take federal, state, local funds. It is the community, and over the years, we've averaged over 12,000 volunteers a year. What we did in this summer is to start training what we call our radical connectors. These are men and women who are wishing to make a difference in the lives of those who are disenfranchised and experiencing homelessness. We have had mentoring programs over the years that is a direct way of making a difference because a lot of those who are experiencing homelessness don't let others know. They're ashamed of it. They need someone who comes and offers them a hand up and cares about them. It's not about numbers. It's not about federal, state, local programs. It's about human to human. And we feel very strongly the call of the gospel and the call of our Catholic social teachings to make a difference in these folks' lives who are being left out.
Yeah, and there is often a stigma around it, which is such a shame.
Oh, yeah.
I kind of want to jump off of what you said, what we're called to do as Catholics for those that are less fortunate. Talk to us about that and what we can do as Catholics to help.
Well, I think that there are many things. Number one is we must not judge the people who are in those circumstances as if it's their fault until we know, particularly the vulnerable and the families. We need to pray for them. We need to be able to support groups that will help them. We are getting ready to start what we call the Give Kids a Home. We just got a report from our Fayette County schools in Lexington that on the 9th day of school, there were over 300 children that were experiencing homelessness. That's a lot of kids. And that's a lot of kids that are trying to get an education and families that are trying to make it because they put the kids in school. But we've got to support them. We've got to surround them with the care, accountability, and love because we're all human. All of us are human, and that connection is so important. So our radical connectors have been trained. We're also very excited about our new effort that is the Dignity Station, where we have a new mobile hygiene unit that is going to be delivered next week that has laundry, showers, and restrooms where we can take to the streets where people can have some of the basic human needs of being clean, of having clean clothes, and maybe gives them just that step up to know that they count, that they're important. They're all God's children.
Absolutely. And Ginny, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us and for all that you're doing. We appreciate it. God bless you.
Well, God bless you, and thank you for this opportunity.
A new document suggests that Catholic institutions in Rome sheltered Jewish people during World War II. Researchers from the Pontifical Biblical Institute found the names of more than 3,000 Jewish people hidden on the grounds of religious buildings and monasteries during the war. The Nazis occupied Rome for almost 9 months. Well, finally tonight, a family from Poland killed back in 1944 for having hidden 8 Jews in their home is due to be beatified on Sunday. This is believed to be the first time an entire family will be beatified together. EWTN Vatican Bureau Chief Andreas Thonhauser has more.
For the first time in the history of the Church, an entire family will be beatified together. The Polish Ulma family, also known as the Samaritans of Markowa. They earned this name as they were moved by the commandment to love and by the example of the Good Samaritan to give refuge to Jews during the Second World War. For this, they were murdered by the Nazi regime. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, on March 24, 1944, in Markowa, a Polish city on the border of modern-day Ukraine, German soldiers arrived at the Ulma family's farm, the home of Josef and Victoria and their 7 children, one of them still in Victoria's womb. The soldiers had one mission: to punish the entire family for violating the German rules against giving any help to Jews. By 1942, the Nazi occupiers of Poland had massacred or deported most of the Jewish inhabitants of Markowa, and many Polish families made the heroic decision to hide Jews in their homes. One of these was the Ulma family. In the face of the Nazi persecution of Poland, and knowing that they would almost certainly be killed if the German authorities found out, the Ulma family still decided to hide their 8 Jewish friends for around a year and a half. They did so in the name of love, as required by the gospel. It was probably a local policeman who informed the German forces that the Ulmas were hiding Jews. On March 24, 1944, the Nazis entered the Ulma farm and discovered the Jews. First, 8 of them were shot, and then the entire family was executed. As she was martyred, Victoria went into labor. In 1995, the Ulma family was added to the list of the righteous among the nations at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Israel, together with 6,000 other Poles. The cause for their canonization began in 2003, and at the end of 2022, Pope Francis approved their beatification as martyrs. On September 10, 2023, at Markova, the beatification of the entire Ulmer family will take place. They are the first family to be beatified together, and the seventh child is counted among the martyrs. As the Catechism teaches, the Church has always held the firm conviction that those who suffer death for the sake of the faith without having received baptism are baptized by their death for and with Christ. The Ulmers died heroically as martyrs and are also considered examples of family life and the beauty of marriage. In Rome, Matteo Cioffi and Andreas Thonhauser, EWTN News Nightly.
And we thank you for watching tonight. Remember, you can follow us on social media, Facebook, X, and Instagram at EWTN News Nightly. I'm Tracy Sable. Good night and God bless.